The year is 1622. In the colonial capital of Luanda, a Portuguese governor waits in his reception hall, seated comfortably in an ornate chair. Before him stands an African delegation, and at its head, a woman of remarkable presence. The governor has deliberately provided no seat for her, a calculated insult meant to force her to negotiate from the floor, in a position of submission. But Queen Nzinga of Ndongo does not kneel. She does not beg. Instead, she gestures to one of her servants, who immediately drops to his hands and knees. Without hesitation, she sits upon his back, as though it were a throne, her eyes meeting the governor's with unwavering confidence. In that single moment, she declares what no treaty could articulate: she is royalty, she is equal, and she will not be diminished. Who was this African queen who refused to bow to an empire and made the world remember her name? To understand the woman who would defy Portugal's colonial machine, we must journey back to the year 1583 to the Kingdom of Ndongo in what is now modern-day Angola. This was a land of rolling highlands and fertile valleys, where the Mbundu people had built a sophisticated society long before European ships appeared on the horizon. The kingdom thrived on agriculture, ironworking, and an extensive trade network that stretched across Central Africa. Salt, ivory, and copper moved along ancient routes, connecting Ndongo to kingdoms far to the east and north. Into this world, a daughter was born to King Kiluwanji Kiasamba. Her name was Nzinga Mbande, though history would come to know her as Queen Nzinga. From the moment of her birth, the circumstances were unusual. According to oral tradition, she was born with her umbilical cord wrapped around her neck, a sign that Mbundu diviners interpreted as an omen. This child, they said, would be proud, intelligent, and destined for greatness. Whether prophecy or coincidence, the prediction would prove remarkably accurate. Nzinga was not raised in the sheltered confines that many might imagine for a royal daughter of her era. Her father, King Kiluwanji, was a warrior and a statesman who understood that his children would inherit a world of complexity and danger. The Portuguese had established their first foothold in the region in the late 1400s, and by the time of Nzinga's birth, their influence was growing with alarming speed. They came not as mere traders, but as colonizers with an insatiable appetite for enslaved people, to work the plantations of Brazil in the Caribbean. Every year, thousands of Africans were being forcibly transported across the Atlantic, and the Portuguese were determined to control the sources of this human cargo. King Kiluwanji recognized that his kingdom's survival would depend not only on military strength, but on diplomatic cunning and strategic intelligence. He ensured that his children, including Nzinga, were educated in the arts of war, governance, and negotiation. This was highly unusual for the time, as leadership roles were typically reserved for men. But Kiluwanji saw something exceptional in his daughter. She possessed a sharp mind, an ability to read people and situations with remarkable clarity, and a courage that did not waver in the face of challenge. As a young woman, Nzinga learned to handle weapons alongside her brothers. She trained in traditional Mbundu combat techniques, understanding that in her world, a leader who could not defend their people would not long remain a leader. But she also learned the subtler arts of statecraft. She studied the Portuguese language, observing the European traders and officials who came to her father's court. She listened carefully to their words, noting the gaps between what they promised and what they delivered. She learned that these foreigners respected strength and cunning, and that they would exploit any sign of weakness. The kingdom of Ndongo during Nzinga's youth was a place of both prosperity and growing tension. The capital, Kabasa, was a bustling center of commerce and culture. Skilled artisans worked in iron and bronze, creating tools, weapons, and objects of beauty. Farmers cultivated millet, sorghum, and beans in the surrounding countryside. The kingdom had its own complex political structure, with the king ruling through a council of nobles and governors who administered various territories. Religious life centered on ancestor veneration and the belief in a supreme creator, with ritual specialists serving as intermediaries between the living and the spiritual world. But this established order was under threat. The Portuguese had founded the city of Luanda on the coast in 1575, turning it into the primary departure point for enslaved Africans bound for the Americas. From this base, they pushed inland, seeking to control the sources of slaves directly rather than relying on African intermediaries. They formed alliances with some African groups while waging war against others, deliberately stoking conflicts that would produce captives for the Atlantic trade. King Kilauea resisted Portuguese encroachment, but the challenge was immense. The Europeans possessed firearms and cannon, technologies that gave them significant military advantages. More insidiously, they employed tactics of divide and conquer, offering trade goods and military support to rival kingdoms willing to raid their neighbors for slaves. The region was increasingly destabilized by these pressures, with warfare becoming more frequent and more brutal. Nzinga witnessed all of this during her formative years. She saw Portuguese soldiers march into Mbundu villages, shackling men, women, and children. She heard the stories of those who had been taken to the coast, never to return. She observed the way some African leaders, desperate for European goods and firearms, became complicit in the trade, betraying their own people for temporary advantage. These experiences shaped her worldview profoundly. She understood that the Portuguese threat was existential, that her people's very survival was at stake. Her father also taught her about diplomacy and the importance of alliances. Ndongo did not exist in isolation. To the north lay the Kingdom of Congo, a powerful state that had established its own complex relationship with the Portuguese, including conversion to Christianity and integration into European trade networks. To the east and south were other Mbundu and related peoples, some allied to Ndongo, others independent or hostile. Nzinga learned that power in this world came not just from military might, but from the ability to forge coalitions, to turn enemies into friends, and to outmaneuver opponents through clever negotiation. By the time she reached adulthood, Nzinga had become an invaluable advisor to her father. She participated in council meetings, offering insights that often proved more astute than those of much older and more experienced nobles. Some at court resented her influence, viewing it as inappropriate for a woman to wield such power. But King Kilauea valued competence above tradition, and he increasingly relied on his daughter's judgment. The situation deteriorated further when Portuguese military expeditions began pushing directly into Ndongo's heartland. In 1579 and again in the 1590s, Portuguese forces launched major offensives, seeking to subjugate the kingdom entirely and turn it into a colony. These were brutal campaigns characterized by scorched earth tactics and mass enslavement. Villages were burned, crops destroyed, and entire populations displaced. King Kilauea led the resistance, and Nzinga stood beside him, not as a passive observer, but as an active participant in planning defensive strategies. The wars took a heavy toll. Thousands died and thousands more were captured and sent into slavery. The kingdom's infrastructure was severely damaged, but Ndongo survived largely because of the determination of its people and the skill of its leadership. Kilauea understood that outright military victory against the Portuguese was unlikely given their technological advantages. Instead, he pursued a strategy of tactical withdrawal, guerrilla warfare, and diplomatic maneuvering, seeking to make the cost of conquest too high for the Europeans to sustain. Nzinga absorbed these lessons. She saw that her father's greatness lay not in his ability to win every battle, but in his refusal to surrender, his capacity to adapt, and his understanding that resistance took many forms. When open battle was impossible, there was ambush. When military force failed, there was negotiation. When treaties were broken by the Portuguese, as they inevitably were, there was the patience to rebuild and try again. Survival itself was a form of victory. As the 16th century gave way to the 17th, the kingdom of Ndongo remained independent but deeply scarred. King Kilauea had grown old, worn down by decades of conflict. The Portuguese had established fortified positions throughout the region, and their demand for slaves continued to grow. The future looked increasingly uncertain, but in his daughter Nzinga, the old king saw a glimmer of hope. She had the intelligence, the courage, and the determination that the kingdom would need in the dark years ahead. He could not have known just how crucial she would become, nor could he have imagined the extraordinary lengths to which she would go to preserve her people's freedom. The death of King Kilauea in 1617 marked the beginning of a turbulent new chapter for Ndongo. The throne passed to Nzinga's brother, Angolan, a man whose character could not have been more different from their father's. While Kilowanji had been a careful strategist who balanced force with diplomacy, Mbandi was impulsive, suspicious, and cruel. Almost immediately upon taking power, he began to consolidate his position through violence and intimidation. One of Mbandi's first acts sent shockwaves through the royal family. Fearing potential rivals to his throne, he ordered the execution of Nzinga's young son. Historical sources suggest he may have also killed other family members he perceived as threats. These were not just political murders, they were deeply personal betrayals that fractured the bonds of kinship that held Mundu society together. For Nzinga, the loss was devastating, but she was trapped, unable to challenge her brother openly without risking her own life, and potentially plunging the kingdom into civil war at a moment when unity was desperately needed. Mbandi's paranoia extended to his sister as well. Recognizing her intelligence and popularity among many nobles, he saw her as a potential threat. Some historical accounts suggest he took steps to ensure she could never have more children, viewing any offspring she might have as rival claimants to the throne. Whether these accounts are entirely accurate remains debated among historians, but what is clear is that Nzinga found herself in an increasingly precarious position, simultaneously one of the most influential people in the kingdom and one of the most vulnerable. Despite his cruelty, or perhaps because of it, Mbandi proved to be an ineffective ruler. The Portuguese continued their aggressive expansion, and Ndongo's military situation deteriorated rapidly. Unlike his father, Mbandi seemed unable to devise effective strategies to counter the European threat. Battles were lost, territory was conceded, and the flow of enslaved people from Ndongo to the coast accelerated. By 1621, the kingdom was in crisis. The Portuguese had recently appointed a new governor, Juan Correa de Sousa, who was determined to finally subjugate Ndongo completely. His forces launched a series of devastating attacks, capturing the fortress of Imbangala, a strategically vital position that controlled access to the kingdom's interior. Portuguese soldiers and their African allies raided deep into Ndongo territory, seizing thousands of people for the slave trade. The kingdom's capital itself came under threat. In desperation, Mbandi realized he needed to negotiate, but he also understood that his own leadership was so compromised that he could not effectively represent Ndongo's interests. He needed someone with intelligence, diplomatic skill, and the ability to command respect from the Portuguese. He needed his sister. However much he feared and resented Nzinga, he could not deny that she was the kingdom's best hope for a favorable settlement. In 1622, Mbandi made a fateful decision. He appointed Nzinga as his official ambassador to the Portuguese, tasking her with traveling to Luanda to negotiate a peace treaty. This was an extraordinary responsibility, placing the kingdom's future in her hands. It was also a mission fraught with danger. The Portuguese were known to seize African emissaries as hostages when negotiations did not go their way. Nzinga would be entering the heart of enemy territory, where her life would depend on her wits and her ability to navigate the treacherous waters of colonial diplomacy. Nzinga prepared meticulously for the journey. She assembled a delegation that would impress the Portuguese with its dignity and sophistication, including advisors, warriors, and attendants dressed in the finest garments available. She studied everything she could learn about the new governor, his priorities, and his weaknesses. She understood that the Portuguese negotiated from a position of military strength, but she also knew that they faced challenges of their own. Portugal was a small country with limited resources, stretched thin by colonial ventures in Asia, Africa, and the Americas. The wars in Ndongo were expensive and yielded diminishing returns as the kingdom's people fled deeper into the interior to escape enslavement. The journey from Kabasa to Luanda took several days, following paths that wound through hills and valleys increasingly scarred by warfare. As Nzinga's delegation approached the coast, they passed through territory now controlled by the Portuguese and their African collaborators. The contrast with Ndongo's heartland was stark. Here the landscape bore the marks of the slave trade: burned villages, abandoned fields, and a pervasive atmosphere of fear. Luanda itself was a bustling but grim settlement. Portuguese colonists, merchants, and soldiers mixed with African slaves, servants, and traders. The city's harbor was crowded with ships, many of them slave vessels preparing to embark on the brutal Middle Passage to the Americas. The sounds of chains, the smell of the sea, and the cries of those being loaded onto ships created a horrifying tableau that Nzinga would never forget. This was where her people ended up if Ndongo fell. This was the fate she had been sent to prevent. Governor João Correia de Sousa received Nzinga's delegation with a mixture of curiosity and calculated disdain. He had heard of this African princess, and he was intrigued by the fact that a woman had been sent on such an important mission. But he was also determined to establish the terms of the meeting in a way that would demonstrate Portuguese superiority and African subordination. This was not merely about practical negotiations. It was about symbolism, about establishing who held power and who did not. The famous meeting took place in the governor's residence, a substantial building that served as both administrative center and symbol of Portuguese authority. When Nzinga was ushered into the governor's presence, she found him seated in an elaborate chair, the clear position of authority. For herself and her delegation, no chairs had been provided. There were only woven mats on the floor, the clear implication being that she should sit below him, in a position that would mark her as a supplicant rather than an equal sovereign. The moment stretched. Everyone in the room understood what was happening. The governor expected Nzinga to accept the insult, to sit on the mat and conduct negotiations from a position of literal and symbolic inferiority. His advisors and the African interpreters present waited to see how this woman would respond. This was a test, and everyone knew it. Nzinga did not hesitate. With a gesture so smooth it seemed almost casual, she indicated one of her attendants. The man immediately understood what was required. He moved forward and dropped to his hands and knees, positioning himself directly before Nzinga. And then, with perfect poise and absolute confidence, she sat upon his back, using her own servant as a living throne. She arranged herself comfortably, adjusted her robes, and then looked directly at the governor, her eyes meeting his with neither deference nor hostility, but with the calm assurance of one equal addressing another. The room fell silent. No one had expected this. It was a moment of pure theater, of symbolic defiance that could not be mistaken. Nzinga had refused the role of subordinate that the governor had tried to force upon her, but she had done so without open confrontation, without giving the Portuguese any pretext to claim she had been disrespectful or aggressive. She had simply asserted her dignity and her status as a representative of a sovereign kingdom. The message was unmistakable. I am not your inferior. I am royalty. I am here to negotiate as an equal, and I will accept nothing less. Governor Correia de Sousa, caught off guard, had little choice but to proceed with the negotiations. To have forced the issue further would have made him appear petty and weak, more concerned with empty symbolism than with substantive discussions. The meeting continued, and to the surprise of many present, Nzinga proved to be a formidable negotiator. She spoke Portuguese fluently, allowing her to communicate directly without relying entirely on interpreters who might soften or distort her words. She demonstrated an impressive command of the details of previous Portuguese-Ndongo relations, citing specific treaties and agreements that the Portuguese had violated. She pointed out that Portugal's aggressive policies had actually undermined their own interests, driving populations away from areas they controlled and making it harder, not easier, to establish stable trade relationships. More boldly, Nzinga challenged the moral foundations of the Portuguese position. She questioned the justice of a nation that claimed to be Christian while engaging in the mass enslavement of human beings. She pointed to the contradictions in Portuguese policy. They claimed to want peace while launching unprovoked attacks. They spoke of trade while seizing goods by force. They professed religious motives while spreading death and suffering. These were not merely rhetorical flourishes. They were calculated arguments designed to create doubt in the minds of her opponents and to establish a moral framework that favored Ndongo's position. The negotiations continued over several days. Nzinga proved willing to make certain concessions to reach an agreement, understanding that diplomacy required give and take. She agreed that Ndongo would provide the Portuguese with limited access to trade goods and would not harbor their enemies. In return, she demanded that the Portuguese withdraw their forces from Ndongo territory, release prisoners who had been captured in recent raids, and recognize her brother's sovereignty over the kingdom. One of the most controversial aspects of the negotiations concerned religion. The Portuguese, like other European colonial powers of the era, viewed the spread of Christianity as both a religious duty and a tool of political control. They pressed Nzinga to convert to Catholicism, arguing that this would demonstrate Ndongo's commitment to peace and alignment with Portuguese interests. After careful consideration, Nzinga agreed to be baptized. In 1622, in a ceremony attended by Portuguese officials and clergy, she was baptized with the Christian name Ana de Sousa, taking the name of the governor's wife, who served as her godmother. This decision has been interpreted in various ways by historians. Some have viewed it as a genuine conversion, pointing to evidence that Nzinga later built churches and supported Christian missionaries in her territories. Others have seen it as a purely pragmatic move, a calculated sacrifice of personal religious beliefs in service of political necessity. The truth may lie somewhere in between. Nzinga was capable of holding multiple worldviews simultaneously, incorporating Christian elements into her life, while also maintaining connections to traditional Mbundu religious practices. What is certain is that she understood the baptism as part of a larger strategic framework, a gesture that would help secure the treaty she had come to negotiate. After weeks of discussions, a treaty was finally concluded. On paper, it appeared to be a diplomatic success for Ndongo. The Portuguese agreed to withdraw from captured fortresses, to return prisoners, and to recognize the kingdom's independence. In return, Ndongo would maintain peaceful relations, permit certain trade activities, and acknowledge a vague Portuguese overlordship that had more symbolic than practical significance. Nzinga returned to Cabasa with what appeared to be a favorable settlement, having averted immediate military disaster through the force of her personality and her diplomatic skill. But experienced observers understood that the treaty's real value would depend on whether the Portuguese honored its terms. And here, history offered little cause for optimism. Time and again, European colonial powers had signed treaties with African states, only to violate them whenever it became convenient. The ink was barely dry on agreements before Portuguese soldiers were back on the march. Portuguese slave traders were back to their brutal commerce, and Portuguese officials were claiming that changed circumstances rendered previous commitments void. Nzinga was not naive. She understood that the treaty she had negotiated was, at best, a temporary respite. It bought time for Ndongo to rebuild its defenses, to recover from recent losses, and to prepare for the conflicts that would inevitably come. But she also understood something more profound. The meeting in Luanda had established her reputation, not just in Ndongo, but throughout the region and even in European circles. She had shown that Africans could meet Europeans on equal terms, that intelligence and courage could counter military superiority, and that dignity was not something that could be taken away by refusing someone a chair. The story of that meeting spread rapidly. African communities throughout the region heard about the princess who had sat on her servant's back rather than accept a position of inferiority. The image was powerful and inspiring, a symbol of resistance that transcended the specific details of the negotiations. For people living under the constant threat of enslavement and colonial violence, Nzinga's defiance offered hope that their own dignity and humanity could not be erased, no matter how powerful their oppressors might seem. Among the Portuguese, reactions were mixed. Some admired Nzinga's intelligence and presence, recognizing in her a worthy adversary. Others dismissed her as a proud and dangerous savage who needed to be humbled. Governor Correa de Sousa himself seems to have been unsettled by the encounter, uncertain how to categorize this African woman who had so deftly outmaneuvered him in their first meeting. His reports to Lisbon described her with a combination of respect and unease, acknowledging her capabilities while warning of the threat she might pose if she ever came to hold real power in Ndongo. That warning would prove prophetic, but in 1622, Nzinga was still subordinate to her brother, still officially only an ambassador and advisor. The question that hung over Ndongo was what would happen next, whether the fragile peace she had negotiated would hold, and whether King Mbandi could provide the leadership necessary to navigate the dangerous years ahead. The answers to those questions would come sooner than anyone expected, and they would propel Nzinga into a role that would define the rest of her life and secure her place in history. The treaty that Nzinga had negotiated with such skill in Luanda proved to be as fragile as she had feared. Within months, it was clear that the Portuguese had little intention of honoring their commitments. The promised withdrawal from Ndongo territory did not materialize. Prisoners were not released. Portuguese military expeditions continued to raid Mbundu villages, seizing people for the slave trade just as they had before. Governor Correia de Sousa, perhaps embarrassed by how Nzinga had outmaneuvered him during their negotiations, seemed determined to demonstrate that Portuguese military power, not diplomatic agreements, would determine the region's future. For King Mbandi, these developments were devastating. He had staked his credibility on the treaty, hoping that it would provide the breathing space Ndongo desperately needed. Instead, he found himself in an even weaker position, having made concessions without receiving any of the promised benefits in return. His support among Ndongo's nobility continued to erode. Nobles questioned his judgment, his courage, and his capacity to defend the kingdom. Some began to explore alternatives, looking to other members of the royal family who might provide more effective leadership. The situation came to a head in 1624. The exact circumstances of what happened next are debated by historians, with various accounts offering different versions of events. What is certain is that King Mbandi died suddenly, and that Nzinga moved quickly to assert her claim to the throne. Some sources suggest that Mbandi, despondent over his failures and increasingly isolated, may have taken his own life. Others hint at more sinister possibilities, suggesting that Nzinga or her supporters may have arranged his death, viewing his continued rule as an unacceptable threat to the kingdom's survival. Still others argue that he died of natural causes, perhaps illness brought on by the stress of his position. The truth may never be known with certainty. What matters more than the precise manner of Mbandi's death is what happened next. Nzinga, recognizing that the kingdom could not afford a prolonged succession crisis in the face of Portuguese aggression, declared herself queen. This was an audacious move. Mbundu tradition, like that of many African societies of the time, generally reserved the highest positions of power for men, while women could wield considerable influence as queen mothers, advisors, or rulers of subsidiary territories. A woman claiming the title of Angola, the supreme ruler, was virtually unprecedented. Nzinga understood the challenge she faced. She needed to secure the support of Ndongo's nobility, military commanders, and common people, all while facing a population that had been conditioned to see male leadership as natural and proper. She also needed to act quickly, before the Portuguese could exploit the succession crisis to launch new attacks or before rival claimants could organize effective opposition. Her response was characteristically bold and pragmatic. She began by emphasizing her qualifications for leadership. She reminded people of her diplomatic success in Luanda, pointing out that she had achieved more through negotiation than her brother had through warfare. She stressed her royal lineage, her education in statecraft, and her deep knowledge of both Mbundu traditions and Portuguese tactics. She promised to provide the strong, stable leadership that the kingdom desperately needed, to reverse the losses of recent years and to restore Ndongo to the power and prosperity it had known under her father. To address concerns about gender, Nzinga made a series of symbolic and practical moves that demonstrated her fitness to rule in terms that her society would understand. She began to dress in ways that combined male and female elements, sometimes appearing in traditional warrior garb rather than the robes typically worn by royal women. She emphasized her military skills, personally participating in combat training and strategic planning. Some accounts suggest she even insisted on being referred to with male pronouns and titles in certain contexts, though this remains a subject of historical debate and may reflect European misunderstandings of Mbundu gender concepts rather than Nzinga's actual practice. More important than symbolism was substance. Nzinga immediately set about reorganizing Ndongo's military and administrative structures. She recognized that the traditional approach to warfare, large set-piece battles, played to Portuguese strengths, given their superior firepower and disciplined formations. Instead, she began to emphasize guerrilla tactics, mobility, and surprise attacks that would neutralize European technological advantages. She dispersed Ndongo's forces into smaller, more flexible units that could strike quickly and fade back into familiar terrain before Portuguese reinforcements could arrive. She also addressed one of the kingdom's fundamental vulnerabilities, the lack of firearms. While Ndongo's warriors were skilled with traditional weapons like spears, bows, and shields, they could not match the killing power of Portuguese muskets and cannon. Nzinga established networks to acquire firearms through trade, sometimes dealing with Dutch merchants who were eager to undermine Portuguese colonial ambitions, other times through captured weapons taken in raids. She ensured that her warriors were trained in the use of these weapons, gradually building a force that could meet Portuguese soldiers on more equal terms. Her administrative reforms were equally important. She recognized that the slave trade had created perverse incentives throughout the region, encouraging warfare and betrayal as leaders sought captives to exchange for European goods. Nzinga worked to redirect Ndongo's economy away from this destructive pattern. She promoted agriculture, craft production, and trade in goods rather than people. She sought to establish Ndongo as a center of commerce that could prosper through peaceful exchange rather than violent predation. But even as she implemented these reforms, Nzinga faced a fundamental problem. Ndongo itself was compromised. The Portuguese and their allies controlled much of the territory that had once belonged to the kingdom. The capital at Cabasa was under constant threat. Many of Ndongo's people had already been enslaved or had fled to neighboring regions. The kingdom that Nzinga had inherited was, in many ways, a hollow shell of its former self. If she was to secure her people's survival, she would need to be bold, creative, and willing to make difficult decisions. The answer came in the form of Matamba, a kingdom to the east of Ndongo. Matamba was a prosperous state that controlled important trade routes and agricultural lands. It had maintained its independence from both the Portuguese and Ndongo, though it had complex relationships with both. In the mid-1620s, Matamba's ruling dynasty faced internal conflicts and external pressures that created an opportunity for intervention. Nzinga made a calculated decision. Rather than remain in Ndongo, fighting a defensive war against overwhelming Portuguese pressure, she would relocate her power base to Matamba. This was not abandonment of her people, but rather a strategic repositioning that would allow her to rebuild strength and eventually return to reclaim Ndongo's lost territories. It was a gamble, but Nzinga had always been willing to take risks when the potential rewards justified them. The process of establishing control over Matamba was complex and involved both diplomacy and military force. Nzinga forged alliances with factions within Matamba who saw her as a preferable alternative to the existing ruling structure. She also used her military forces to pressure and eventually overthrow Matamba's queen. By around 1631, Nzinga had successfully established herself as the ruler of Matamba while still claiming authority over Ndongo. She now controlled a consolidated territory with greater resources and better defensive positions than Ndongo alone could provide. This period of consolidation also revealed another dimension of Nzinga's character, her ruthlessness when she believed it necessary. The historical record contains accounts of harsh measures she took against rivals and those who resisted her authority. She could be unforgiving to those she saw as traitors, and she was willing to use violence to secure her position. These actions trouble modern sensibilities, and they troubled some of her contemporaries as well. But they must be understood in context. Nzinga was operating in a world of extraordinary brutality, where the Portuguese thought nothing of massacring entire villages and enslaving thousands. In such an environment, mercy could be seen as weakness, and weakness meant not just personal defeat, but the destruction of her people. Nzinga chose survival, and she did what she believed survival required. Her establishment as Queen of Matamba, while still claiming Ndongo, created a curious political situation. She now ruled or claimed to rule multiple territories, making her one of the most powerful leaders in the region. But this power came with responsibilities and challenges. She needed to integrate diverse populations under her authority, to maintain military pressure against the Portuguese while managing complex diplomatic relationships with other African states, and to build economic systems that could sustain her war effort over what was clearly going to be a prolonged conflict. One of her most controversial decisions during this period concerned the slave trade itself. Historical evidence suggests that Nzinga, despite her opposition to Portuguese enslavement of her own people, participated in the slave trade when it served her strategic interests. She raided communities that allied with the Portuguese, taking captives who were then either integrated into her own society, held for ransom, or traded for weapons and goods she needed. This participation in the very system she was fighting against presents a moral complexity that historians continue to grapple with. Some argue that Nzinga was simply a pragmatist, willing to use any tool available to resist Portuguese control, even if that meant engaging in practices that were themselves deeply unjust. Others suggest that there may have been distinctions in her mind between different forms of enslavement, that taking war captives and incorporating them into Mundu society, where they might eventually gain freedom and status, was fundamentally different from the chattel slavery of the Atlantic trade, where people were treated as commodities and their descendants remained enslaved in perpetuity. Still others point out that in the context of Central African politics of the time, taking captives in warfare was a normalized practice that predated European contact, and that Nzinga's actions, while morally troubling from a modern perspective, were not unusual for a leader of her era. What is clear is that Nzinga's moral universe was shaped by her primary commitment, the survival and independence of her people. Everything else was subordinate to that goal. If that meant making alliances with slavers when necessary, she would do so. If it meant participating in practices she might have found distasteful, she would do so. If it meant being ruthless with enemies and rivals, she would do so. This was not hypocrisy or moral blindness, but rather the calculation of a leader operating in desperate circumstances, where the alternative to compromise was annihilation. By the early 1630s, Nzinga had achieved something remarkable. She had consolidated her rule over Matamba, maintained her claim to Ndongo despite Portuguese occupation of much of its territory, and built a military force capable of challenging European armies. She had transformed herself from a princess serving as her brother's ambassador into one of the most formidable political and military leaders in Central Africa. She had done this despite facing opposition based on her gender, despite operating with far fewer resources than her enemies, and despite the constant pressure of Portuguese aggression. But the greatest challenges still lay ahead. The Portuguese were not about to accept the existence of an independent, hostile power in the heart of the region they sought to control. They would continue to pursue Nzinga with armies, with treachery, and with unrelenting pressure. And Nzinga, for her part, was not content merely to survive. She dreamed of driving the Portuguese entirely out of her lands, of restoring Ndongo to its former glory, and of building a kingdom that could stand as a beacon of African independence in an age of European expansion. The question was whether she had the strength, the cunning, and the endurance to turn that dream into a reality. The 1630s and 1640s marked the height of Nzinga's military struggle against Portuguese colonialism. These were decades defined by constant warfare, shifting alliances, and a level of strategic complexity that tested every aspect of her leadership. Nzinga was no longer simply defending a kingdom, she was leading a sustained resistance movement that would inspire people throughout the region and challenge the foundations of Portuguese power in West Central Africa. The Portuguese, for their part, were determined to crush Nzinga once and for all. They viewed her not just as an obstacle to their colonial ambitions, but as a symbol of African resistance that threatened the entire edifice of their authority. If an African woman could defy Portugal's armies and maintain her independence, what message did that send to other African leaders who might be contemplating resistance? What would it mean for Portuguese prestige, not just in Africa, but throughout their global empire? Nzinga had to be defeated, and defeated decisively. The Portuguese strategy involved multiple approaches. They launched direct military expeditions, sending armies equipped with firearms and supported by African allies into Matamba territory. They attempted to economically isolate Nzinga by controlling trade routes and cutting off her access to goods and weapons. They worked to turn her allies against her, offering inducements to African leaders who would break with her and submit to Portuguese authority. And they attempted to undermine her legitimacy, spreading propaganda that portrayed her as a tyrant, a usurper, and an enemy of Christianity. Nzinga countered each of these strategies with remarkable ingenuity. Against Portuguese military expeditions, she employed guerrilla tactics that had proven effective since her early days as queen. Her forces would avoid direct confrontation with large Portuguese armies, instead harassing supply lines, ambushing isolated units, and striking at vulnerable positions before melting back into the countryside. The terrain worked to her advantage. Matamba's highlands and forests were difficult for European forces to navigate, especially when local populations provided intelligence to Nzinga rather than to the invaders. One of Nzinga's most effective military innovations was her use of highly mobile warrior units that could strike rapidly across wide areas. She organized her forces into disciplined companies that could move quickly, live off the land, and maintain cohesion even during extended campaigns. These units included warriors skilled with traditional weapons as well as those trained in the use of firearms. Nzinga ensured that her commanders understood both conventional and irregular warfare, able to switch between tactics as circumstances demanded. She also recognized the importance of fortifications and defensive positions. Throughout Matamba, she established a network of protected settlements and strongholds that could serve as bases for her forces and refugees for civilian populations during Portuguese attacks. These were not elaborate castles in the European style, but practical defensive positions that used natural features like hills and rivers, supplemented by earthworks and palisades. They provided her people with places of safety and gave her military forces secure positions from which to launch operations. The economic war was equally important. Nzinga understood that Portuguese colonial power rested on the slave trade and the extraction of African resources. She worked to disrupt both. Her forces attacked Portuguese trading posts and the African intermediaries who supplied them with slaves. She raided caravans carrying goods to the coast, seizing weapons, cloth, and other valuable items. She attempted to redirect trade flows away from Portuguese-controlled areas and toward territories under her influence, building alternative commercial networks that would weaken Portuguese economic power while strengthening her own. One of the most significant developments of this period was Nzinga's relationship with the Imbangala, a group of fierce warriors who had previously been among her most dangerous enemies. The Imbangala were a military society that had emerged during the turbulent years of Portuguese expansion. They operated as mercenaries and raiders, developing a fearsome reputation for their combat effectiveness and their willingness to engage in extreme violence. They had initially allied with the Portuguese, serving as auxiliaries in campaigns against Ndongo and other African states. Recognizing both the threat the Imbangala posed and the opportunity they represented, Nzinga made a bold decision. She would bring them into her coalition. Through a combination of diplomacy, strategic marriages, and demonstration of her own military prowess, she gradually built alliances with various Imbangala bands. This was not an easy process. It required her to adopt some of their practices and customs, to prove herself according to their warrior codes, and to offer them a vision of success that was more appealing than continued service to the Portuguese. By the mid-1630s, significant numbers of Imbangala warriors had joined Nzinga's cause. They brought with them military skills and a ruthless effectiveness that made her forces even more formidable. The alliance was controversial. The Imbangala's reputation for violence and their role in the slave trade made them problematic allies for a leader fighting against colonial oppression. But Nzinga, ever the pragmatist, valued their military contribution and believed she could channel their energies toward resistance rather than predation. The integration of Imbangala forces into her military structure required Nzinga to adapt her leadership style. She had to command the respect of warriors who valued martial prowess above all else. Historical accounts from this period describe her personally leading forces into battle, fighting alongside her warriors, and demonstrating the physical courage that Imbangala culture demanded of leaders. She would dress in military garb, wielding weapons, and participating directly in combat operations. Whether these accounts are entirely accurate or somewhat embellished, they reflect a reality. Nzinga was not a distant ruler directing forces from a palace, but an active military commander who shared the dangers and hardships of war with her soldiers. The year 1641 brought a dramatic shift in the strategic landscape. Portugal was locked in a wider struggle with the Dutch Republic, one of the great European powers of the era. The Dutch were challenging Portuguese colonial dominance in multiple theaters, including West Africa. Recognizing that the enemy of their enemy might be their friend, Dutch forces attacked and captured Luanda, the Portuguese colonial capital. This was a stunning development that fundamentally altered the balance of power in the region. Nzinga immediately recognized the opportunity. She reached out to the Dutch, proposing an alliance against their common Portuguese enemy. The Dutch, for their part, saw the strategic value of partnering with the most powerful indigenous leader in the region. An alliance was formed, one of the most remarkable diplomatic achievements of Nzinga's career. Here was an African queen, operating from an interior kingdom, forming a military and commercial alliance with a major European power on terms of approximate equality. The Dutch-Nzinga alliance proved highly effective in the short term. Combined operations involving Dutch military forces and Nzinga's warriors pushed the Portuguese back across wide areas. Towns and fortresses that had been under Portuguese control for decades fell to the Allies. Trade routes were secured, and Portuguese economic power in the region contracted dramatically. For a brief period, it seemed as though the dream of driving the Portuguese entirely out of the region might actually be achievable. Nzinga and the Dutch coordinated their military operations with impressive efficiency. Dutch forces, with their superior naval power and artillery, could attack Portuguese positions from the coast and along rivers. Nzinga's forces operated in the interior, cutting off Portuguese retreat routes and preventing them from consolidating defensive positions. The Portuguese found themselves caught between two effective military forces, unable to concentrate their strength against either without exposing themselves to the other. The alliance was not without tensions. The Dutch had their own commercial interests, and while they opposed Portuguese slavery operations, they were quite willing to engage in the slave trade themselves under different arrangements. Nzinga had to navigate these complexities carefully, ensuring that her alliance with the Dutch served her interests without simply replacing Portuguese exploitation with Dutch exploitation. She insisted on maintaining her autonomy, making clear that she was an ally, not a subordinate. During this period, Nzinga also worked to build a broader coalition of African states and communities opposed to Portuguese colonialism. She reached out to the Kingdom of Congo, which had its own complex and often troubled relationship with the Portuguese. She communicated with other Ubuntu leaders, with communities that had fled Portuguese slavery, and with kingdoms farther to the east and south. Her vision was ambitious, a coordinated African resistance that could match European power through unity and strategic cooperation. This diplomatic effort had mixed results. Some African leaders were willing to coordinate with Nzinga, recognizing the common threat they faced. Others were more cautious, concerned about the risks of open opposition to Portuguese power, or suspicious of Nzinga's ambitions. Still others had become so dependent on Portuguese trade goods and so implicated in the slave trade that they saw their interests as aligned with the colonizers rather than with African resistance. The political landscape was fragmented and complex, and building lasting coalitions proved enormously challenging. The mid-1640s saw intense military campaigning. Nzinga's forces, often in coordination with Dutch units, launched attacks throughout Portuguese-controlled territories. They targeted slave traders, destroyed plantations, freed enslaved people, and seized Portuguese goods and weapons. These campaigns took a terrible toll on Portuguese colonial infrastructure. Luanda, even after being recaptured by the Portuguese in 1648, remained economically weakened. Portuguese control over the interior had been severely compromised. The costs of maintaining their colony were spiraling upward, while the returns from the slave trade had declined. But the war also took a toll on Nzinga's people. Constant military mobilization meant that less labor was available for agriculture and other productive activities. The disruption of trade, even of the exploitative colonial trade, created shortages of goods that people had come to depend on. Casualties mounted as battles were fought and villages were raided. Families were separated, communities were displaced, and the social fabric of the region was strained to the breaking point. Nzinga herself was aging. She was now in her 60s, an advanced age for the time, especially given the physical demands of her lifestyle. But she showed no signs of slowing down. Historical accounts from this period describe her as still actively involved in military operations, still making strategic decisions, and still commanding the respect and loyalty of her followers. Her energy and determination seemed inexhaustible, fueled by a lifetime of struggle and an unwavering commitment to her people's freedom. The recapture of Luanda by Portuguese forces in 1648 marked the beginning of the end for the Dutch presence in the region. Without their capital and facing challenges in other parts of their global empire, the Dutch gradually withdrew from West Central Africa. This was a devastating blow to Nzinga's position. She had counted on Dutch military and economic support to balance Portuguese power. Without it, she found herself once again facing the Portuguese largely alone, though with her own power base in Matamba more secure than it had been in decades. The Portuguese, having reclaimed their colonial capital, sought to re-establish their dominance over the region. But they had learned painful lessons from the previous years of conflict. They had come to respect Nzinga's military capabilities and to recognize that defeating her through military force alone would be difficult and costly. They began to shift their strategy, placing greater emphasis on negotiation, on attempting to bring Nzinga into some form of accommodation with Portuguese power rather than destroying her outright. For Nzinga, these overtures presented a dilemma. She had spent decades fighting the Portuguese, sacrificing everything to maintain her independence. But she was also realistic about the limits of her power. Matamba was secure, but reclaiming all of Ndongo seemed increasingly unlikely. Her people were exhausted from constant warfare. The dream of complete victory over the Portuguese had faded. Perhaps it was time to secure what could be secured, to ensure that Matamba at least would remain free, even if the larger goal of driving the Portuguese from the region entirely had to be deferred to future generations. The late 1640s and early 1650s saw sporadic fighting punctuated by diplomatic communications. Portuguese officials and Nzinga's representatives met periodically to discuss possible terms for peace. These negotiations were complicated by mutual distrust, by the competing interests of various Portuguese factions, and by Nzinga's determination not to accept any agreement that would compromise her sovereignty. She would negotiate, she would make pragmatic concessions, but she would not surrender, and she would not accept Portuguese authority over her kingdom. During this period, Nzinga also worked to secure her legacy. She had no direct heirs who could succeed her, a consequence of the tragedies of her early life. She needed to ensure that Matamba would remain stable and independent after her death. She groomed potential successors from among her extended family and trusted advisors. She strengthened Matamba's administrative structures, ensuring that the kingdom had institutions that could function even without her direct leadership. She worked to secure Matamba's economy, promoting agriculture and trade that would sustain the kingdom through future challenges. Her relationship with Christianity during this period remains a subject of historical debate. She had been baptized decades earlier as part of her diplomatic strategy, taking the Christian name Ana de Sousa. Throughout her wars with the Portuguese, her relationship with the Catholic Church had been complex. At times, she supported missionaries and permitted church construction in her territories. At other times, she expelled clergy she viewed as Portuguese agents. Now in her later years, she seemed to move toward a more genuine engagement with Christian faith, though always on her own terms, always integrated with, rather than replacing traditional Mbundu beliefs. In 1656, after decades of conflict, a peace treaty was finally concluded between Nzinga and the Portuguese. The terms reflected the military stalemate that had emerged. Portugal recognized Matamba's independence under Nzinga's rule. Nzinga, in turn, agreed to permit Portuguese missionaries in her territory and to maintain peaceful commercial relations. Neither side achieved everything they had sought, but both secured crucial interests. For Portugal, the treaty meant an end to costly military operations and the possibility of stable trade relationships. For Nzinga, it meant recognition of her sovereignty and security for her people. The treaty marked the end of active warfare, but not the end of Nzinga's significance. She had achieved something extraordinary. She had fought the Portuguese Empire to a standstill, maintaining her independence and her people's freedom through decades of conflict. She had proven that African leaders could match European powers in military skill, diplomatic cunning, and sheer determination. She had created a kingdom that would outlast her, a legacy that would inspire future generations. The question now was what she would do with the peace she had fought so hard to achieve. The alliance between Nzinga and the Dutch West India Company, forged in the crucible of shared opposition to Portuguese colonialism, represents one of the most fascinating chapters in 17th century global politics. It was a partnership that brought together an African queen and a European commercial power in a relationship that defied the typical patterns of European-African relations during the age of colonialism. To understand this alliance fully requires examining the broader context of European rivalries, the strategic calculations of both parties, and the ultimate limits of their cooperation. The Dutch Republic in the early 17th century was emerging as one of Europe's great powers. Having won independence from Spain through decades of warfare, the Dutch had built a formidable commercial and naval empire. The Dutch East India Company dominated trade in Asia, while the Dutch West India Company focused on Africa and the Americas. The Dutch were not primarily driven by religious or civilizing missions, as they sometimes claimed, but by commercial interests. They wanted to dominate global trade, and Portugal, with its extensive colonial holdings in Africa, Asia, and South America, was a prime competitor and target. When Dutch forces first arrived off the coast of West Central Africa in the late 1630s, they were pursuing a deliberate strategy of attacking Portuguese colonial assets worldwide. Brazil, Portugal's most valuable colony, was partially occupied by Dutch forces. Portuguese positions in Asia were under assault. West Africa, with its critical role in the slave trade and its strategic location, was another natural target. The capture of Luanda in 1641 was part of this global strategy, an attempt to seize one of Portugal's most important African bases. For Nzinga, the Dutch arrival presented an unprecedented opportunity. She had been fighting the Portuguese for decades with varying degrees of success, but always as a regional power limited by resources and technology. The Dutch brought naval power, advanced weaponry, and European military expertise that could potentially tip the balance decisively against the Portuguese. Moreover, the Dutch had commercial interests that did not necessarily require Portuguese-style colonial control. They might be content with trading relationships that respected African sovereignty, or so Nzinga hoped. The initial contact between Nzinga and the Dutch was handled with careful diplomacy on both sides. Nzinga sent representatives to Luanda to meet with Dutch officials, proposing a military alliance against the Portuguese. The Dutch, recognizing that they needed local allies who understood the region and could provide intelligence and military support, responded positively. Negotiations began on the terms of an alliance, with both sides seeking advantages while trying to avoid becoming overly dependent on the other. The treaty that emerged from these negotiations was remarkable for its relative equality. Nzinga was recognized as a sovereign queen, not as a subordinate chief or vassal. The Dutch agreed to provide military support and access to trade goods, including firearms and ammunition. In return, Nzinga would coordinate military operations against the Portuguese and would grant the Dutch favorable trading terms in territories under her control. Critically, the agreement did not give the Dutch political authority over Matamba or the right to establish permanent military bases in Nzinga's territory without her consent. The military cooperation that followed was extensive and effective. Dutch and Nzinga's forces launched coordinated campaigns throughout Portuguese-controlled territories. Dutch naval power allowed them to attack coastal positions and to move forces and supplies along rivers that flowed to the coast. Nzinga's warriors, with their knowledge of the interior and their guerrilla warfare expertise, could strike at Portuguese positions inland and prevent Portuguese forces from consolidating defenses. The combination proved devastating to Portuguese colonial infrastructure. One of the most significant joint operations was the campaign to reclaim territories in Ndongo that had been under Portuguese occupation for years. Dutch artillery supported attacks on fortified Portuguese positions, while Nzinga's forces cut off supply lines and prevented reinforcements from arriving. Town after town fell to the Allies. Enslaved people were freed, Portuguese colonists fled, and African communities that had been forced to cooperate with the Portuguese began to shift their allegiance to Nzinga. The psychological impact of these victories was as important as their military significance. For decades, the Portuguese had claimed civilizational and military superiority over Africans. They had portrayed resistance as futile and submission as inevitable. The success of the Dutch-Nzinga alliance shattered these claims. African communities throughout the region could see that the Portuguese were not invincible, that coordinated resistance could succeed, and that there were alternatives to colonial subjugation. But the alliance also exposed tensions and contradictions that would ultimately limit its success. The Dutch, despite their opposition to Portuguese colonialism, were themselves deeply involved in the slave trade. They had no moral objection to slavery as such. They simply wanted to control the trade themselves rather than letting the Portuguese monopolize it. This created immediate problems. Nzinga's stated goal was to protect her people from enslavement, yet her Dutch allies were actively seeking slaves to transport to their colonies in the Americas. Nzinga navigated this contradiction through a combination of pragmatism and careful negotiation. She made clear that the Dutch could not raid for slaves in territories under her protection. Her people were off limits. However, she did not object to the Dutch trading for slaves obtained through other means, including from African leaders who were enemies or rivals of hers. This arrangement allowed the alliance to function while maintaining a distinction, however morally problematic from a modern perspective, between protecting her own people and participating in the broader slave trade system. The alliance also faced challenges related to cultural differences and communication. European and African military cultures had different approaches to warfare, different concepts of honor and acceptable conduct, and different expectations about the treatment of prisoners and civilians. Dutch commanders sometimes found Nzinga's warriors too independent and undisciplined by European standards. Nzinga, for her part, was sometimes frustrated by Dutch caution and their focus on holding fixed positions rather than pursuing mobile warfare. Despite these tensions, the alliance achieved remarkable successes during the early and mid-1640s. By 1646, Portuguese power in the region had been severely weakened. Luanda remained under Dutch control, and vast interior territories that Portugal had claimed were now either under Nzinga's authority or in dispute. It seemed possible that Portugal might be driven out of West Central Africa entirely, a development that would have had profound implications for the Atlantic slave trade and for European colonialism more broadly. But the tide began to turn in 1647 and 1648. Portugal, having stabilized its position after decades of war with Spain and internal political turmoil, was able to focus more resources on reclaiming its African colonies. A large Portuguese fleet arrived off the coast of Luanda in 1648, carrying thousands of troops and substantial military supplies. The Dutch garrison in Luanda, undermanned and facing supply shortages, found itself under siege. Nzinga attempted to support her allies, launching attacks on Portuguese forces besieging the city and trying to disrupt their supply lines. But without naval power, she could not prevent the Portuguese from maintaining maritime access to Luanda. Dutch reinforcements, which might have broken the siege, never arrived in sufficient numbers. The Dutch West India Company, facing challenges in multiple theaters, and particularly concerned about its holdings in Brazil, made the strategic decision to prioritize other areas over West Central Africa. In August 1648, after a siege lasting several months, Dutch forces in Luanda surrendered to the Portuguese. The surrender terms allowed the Dutch garrison to withdraw with honors of war, boarding ships that would carry them away from West Central Africa. With their departure, the brief period of Dutch presence in the region came to an end. The Dutch would maintain some trading posts and commercial relationships in other parts of West Africa, but they would not again attempt to challenge Portuguese dominance in what is now Angola. For Nzinga, the Dutch withdrawal was a bitter blow. She had invested heavily in the alliance, had coordinated her military strategy with Dutch plans, and had allowed herself to hope that combined European and African forces might finally drive the Portuguese from the region. Now she found herself once again facing Portuguese power without the advantages that Dutch support had provided. Her enemies could claim that her alliance with heretic Protestants had failed, that Catholic Portugal had proven stronger than its rivals, and that she should abandon resistance and seek accommodation. But Nzinga refused to surrender. Even without Dutch support, she retained control over Matamba and significant portions of what had once been Ndongo. Her military forces, though they had suffered losses, remained capable and loyal. Her reputation as a leader had been enhanced rather than diminished by the alliance. She had proven that she could deal with European powers as an equal, that she could coordinate complex military operations, and that she could maintain her political independence even while working with foreign allies. The collapse of the Dutch alliance also offered a lesson that Nzinga absorbed deeply. European powers, however opposed to each other they might be, ultimately prioritized their own interests above any commitment to African independence. The Dutch had been useful allies, but when their strategic calculations changed, they had withdrawn without much concern for the consequences for their African partners. Future alliances, should any be formed, would have to account for this reality. Trust but verify. Cooperate but maintain independence. Never become so dependent on European support that its withdrawal would be catastrophic. In the aftermath of the Dutch departure, Nzinga reorganized her strategies and rebuilt her defenses. She had lost some territories to renewed Portuguese offensives, but Matamba itself remained secure. Her core military forces were intact, her administrative structures were functioning, and most importantly, her determination was undiminished. The war was not over. It had simply entered a new phase, one that would require different tactics and different strategies, but that would continue nonetheless. The Peace Treaty of 1656 marked a fundamental shift in Nzinga's life and in the history of the region. After decades of near-constant warfare, an uneasy but genuine peace settled over Matamba and its relations with Portuguese Angola. Nzinga, now in her 70s, turned her attention from military campaigns to the challenges of governance, economic development, and securing her legacy. These final years of her life revealed dimensions of her character and capabilities that had been somewhat obscured by the necessities of war. Matamba, under Nzinga's rule, developed into a relatively prosperous and well-organized kingdom. She established a capital that served as both an administrative center and a commercial hub. Markets flourished, drawing traders from across the region and even from Portuguese territories. Agricultural production expanded as people who had fled warfare were able to return to their fields. Skilled artisans found patronage and protection, producing goods for both local use and regional trade. The kingdom developed institutions of governance that could function effectively even during Nzinga's frequent absences on military campaigns or diplomatic missions. One of Nzinga's key priorities during this period was restructuring Matamba's economy to reduce dependence on the slave trade. This was both a moral and a practical decision. Morally, Nzinga had spent her life fighting against the enslavement of her people. While she had engaged in slaving as a wartime tactic and political tool, she understood that building a society fundamentally dependent on capturing and selling human beings created unsustainable social dynamics and inevitable conflicts. Practically, the slave trade inherently destabilized regions by encouraging warfare and predation rather than productive economic activities. Under Nzinga's direction, Matamba developed thriving agricultural sectors. The kingdom's fertile lands produced surplus grain, vegetables, and other crops that could be traded regionally. Livestock herding expanded, with cattle becoming both a measure of wealth and a trade commodity. Salt mining and ironworking, traditional sources of regional trade goods, were promoted and protected. Matamba positioned itself as a center for trade in these goods rather than in human captives, attempting to build economic relationships that would support peace rather than war. This economic transformation was never complete. The slave trade remained a dominant feature of the regional economy, and Matamba could not entirely separate itself from this system. But Nzinga succeeded in diversifying her kingdom's economic base and in reducing its dependence on slaving to a degree that was unusual for the time and place. This provided Matamba with greater economic stability and reduced the incentives for conflicts with neighboring communities. Nzinga also focused significant attention on legal and administrative systems. She established courts that could resolve disputes according to both traditional Mbundu law and newer principles she introduced. She appointed governors to administer different regions of her kingdom, ensuring that her authority was represented throughout her territory. She developed systems for collecting taxes and tribute that provided the state with resources while not overburdening her subjects. These administrative achievements are often overlooked in accounts that focus primarily on her military career, but they were essential to Matamba's stability and prosperity. Her relationship with Christianity deepened during these final years, though it remained complex and syncretic. After the peace treaty, Portuguese Catholic missionaries were permitted to establish themselves in Matamba. Nzinga supported the construction of churches and provided resources for missionary activities. She participated in Christian rituals and encouraged her subjects to receive instruction in the faith. By the time of her death, Matamba had a small but growing Christian population and several functioning missions. But Nzinga's Christianity was distinctly African in character. She did not abandon traditional Ubuntu religious practices and beliefs. Ancestor veneration continued, traditional ritual specialists maintained their roles, and spiritual practices that predated Christianity remained integral to daily life. Christian elements were integrated into this existing framework rather than replacing it. This syncretic approach troubled some European missionaries who wanted complete conversion, but it reflected Nzinga's broader approach to foreign influences. Take what is useful, adapt it to local circumstances, but never lose core identity. One of the persistent questions about Nzinga's final years concerns her motives for this deeper engagement with Christianity. Was it genuine spiritual conviction, belated acceptance of teachings she had first encountered decades earlier? Was it political pragmatism, a way to improve relations with the Portuguese and to access the educational and commercial networks that accompanied Christian missions? Was it concern for her soul and the afterlife, a natural development as she contemplated mortality? The historical sources do not provide definitive answers, and it is entirely possible that all of these factors played some role in her thinking. What is clear is that Nzinga retained her political independence and her cultural identity even while engaging with Christianity. She was baptized as Ana de Sousa, but she never ceased to be Nzinga, Queen of Matamba and Ndongo. The Christianity she practiced was filtered through her own understanding and integrated into a worldview that remained fundamentally rooted in African traditions. She accepted missionaries but expected them to respect her authority and to adapt to local customs. Her Christianity, like everything else in her life, was on her own terms. As she aged, Nzinga had to confront the question of succession. She had no surviving children of her own, a consequence of the tragedies of her early life and the deliberate actions of her brother to prevent her from producing heirs. This presented a significant challenge. Without a clear line of succession, Matamba could descend into civil war upon her death, with various factions supporting different claimants. Everything she had built could be destroyed by internal conflict, leaving her people vulnerable to Portuguese exploitation. Nzinga addressed this challenge through careful preparation. She identified her sister Barbara as her designated successor, working to build support for this choice among Matamba's nobility and military commanders. She ensured that Barbara understood the responsibilities of rule and was prepared to assume them. She gradually transferred some administrative functions to her sister, allowing Barbara to gain experience while Nzinga was still alive to provide guidance and support. She made clear to all concerned that any challenge to Barbara's succession would be considered treason and would be dealt with accordingly. Historical accounts from the 1650s describe Nzinga as remaining remarkably active despite her advanced age. She continued to participate in administrative decisions, to receive foreign visitors and ambassadors, and to maintain oversight of her kingdom's affairs. She was known for her sharp mind, her ability to recall details from decades past, and her continued capacity for strategic thinking. Age had slowed her physically, but mentally she remained formidable until nearly the end of her life. In 1663, Nzinga fell ill. The exact nature of her illness is not recorded in detail in surviving sources, but it was clear to those around her that she was dying. She spent her final days putting her affairs in order, issuing final instructions to her officials and advisors, and preparing for death. According to Catholic sources, she received the last rites of the Church and died in a state of Christian grace. According to Mbundu traditions, she was honored with the full ceremonies due to a great queen, with proper rituals to ensure her transition to the world of the ancestors. Queen Nzinga died on December 17, 1663, at approximately 80 years of age. She had ruled for nearly 40 years through decades of warfare, political upheaval, and cultural transformation. She had led armies, negotiated with European powers, built a kingdom, and secured her people's independence against overwhelming odds. She had transformed herself from a princess in a threatened kingdom into one of the most significant political and military leaders of 17th century Africa, and now her extraordinary life had come to an end. Her funeral was an event of great significance. Thousands gathered to mourn her passing and to celebrate her life. Portuguese officials attended, recognizing the importance of maintaining good relations with Matamba during the transition to new leadership. Representatives from neighboring African kingdoms came to pay their respects. Her body was interred with full honors, in ceremonies that blended Christian and traditional elements, reflecting the complex cultural synthesis that had characterized her reign. Barbara succeeded to the throne as Nzinga had planned, assuming the title of queen and the responsibilities of rule. The succession was smooth, testimony to Nzinga's careful preparation and to the loyalty she had inspired among her subjects. Matamba would continue as an independent kingdom for many more years, maintaining its autonomy and its cultural identity. The peace with Portugal that Nzinga had negotiated would hold, providing the region with a period of stability that had been absent for decades. But even as life in Matamba continued under new leadership, it was clear that something irreplaceable had been lost. Nzinga had been more than a political leader or military commander. She had been a symbol, a living embodiment of resistance to colonial control, a proof that Africans could stand equal to Europeans in intelligence, courage, and political skill. Her death marked the end of an era, the passing of a generation that had witnessed the first great confrontation between African independence and European colonialism in West Central Africa. More than 3.5 centuries have passed since Queen Nzinga's death, yet her legacy continues to resonate across Africa and throughout the African diaspora. She has become a symbol of resistance, of female empowerment, of African dignity in the face of colonial oppression. Her story has been told and retold, adapted to speak to new generations facing their own struggles. But beyond the symbolism, what is the historical significance of this remarkable woman? And what lessons does her life offer to us today? Nzinga's most obvious legacy is political. She demonstrated that African leaders could successfully resist European colonialism through a combination of military prowess, diplomatic skill, and strategic flexibility. While many African states were conquered or subordinated during the age of European expansion, Nzinga maintained her independence for 4 decades. Matamba survived as a sovereign kingdom throughout her lifetime and for years afterward. This was an achievement that few African leaders of her era could match, and it provided inspiration for later resistance movements throughout the colonial period. Her success came not from any single strategy, but from her ability to adapt to changing circumstances. When conventional warfare failed against Portuguese firepower, she adopted guerrilla tactics. When military force alone was insufficient, she pursued diplomacy. When the Portuguese seemed too powerful to defeat directly, she sought European allies to balance their power. When opportunities arose, she seized them boldly. When defeat loomed, she retreated to rebuild her strength. This strategic flexibility, this willingness to use whatever tools were available without being locked into rigid ideological positions, was perhaps her greatest political gift. Nzinga also left a legacy as a female leader who succeeded in a male-dominated world. She ruled not as a regent or queen mother acting for a male heir, but as queen in her own right, commanding armies and making policy without male mediation. She faced significant opposition based on her gender, and she overcame it through demonstrated competence, political cunning, and sheer force of personality. For women across Africa and beyond who have faced discrimination and limitation based on gender, Nzinga's example offers powerful inspiration. She proved that women could lead, could fight, could rule as effectively as any man. Yet Nzinga's legacy is complicated by the moral ambiguities of her life. She participated in the slave trade even while fighting against the enslavement of her own people. She could be ruthless, even cruel, to those she saw as enemies or threats. She made alliances with Europeans who were themselves colonizers and exploiters. She adapted Christian religion in ways that served her political purposes. These complexities remind us that historical figures, however heroic, are products of their times, shaped by the moral frameworks and practical necessities of their eras. Understanding Nzinga requires neither hagiography nor condemnation, but rather an appreciation for the difficult choices she faced and the context in which she made them. Her cultural legacy in Angola and throughout Central Africa remains profound. She is celebrated as a national hero, a founding figure in Angolan identity. Schools, streets, and institutions bear her name. Her image appears on currency and in public monuments. She is invoked in political discourse as a symbol of national pride and resistance to foreign control. During Angola's long struggle for independence from Portuguese colonialism in the 20th century, Nzinga was frequently cited as an ancestral model of resistance, proof that fighting for freedom was part of the nation's historical identity. In the broader African diaspora, particularly in the Americas where millions of enslaved Africans were forcibly transported, Nzinga has become an important figure in reclaiming African history and identity. For centuries, racist ideologies portrayed Africa as a continent without history, without great leaders, without achievements worth remembering. The recovery and celebration of figures like Nzinga challenges these narratives. She stands as evidence of African political sophistication, military capability, and cultural achievement. She reminds descendants of enslaved Africans that they come from peoples with proud histories, peoples who fought for their freedom and dignity. Nzinga's life also offers lessons about leadership that transcend her specific historical moment. She understood that effective leadership requires more than just courage or intelligence, though she possessed both in abundance. It requires the ability to read situations accurately, to understand the motivations and capabilities of allies and enemies alike, to make difficult decisions under pressure, and to maintain resolve in the face of setbacks and defeats. These are timeless qualities, as relevant today as they were in 17th century Angola. Her diplomatic skills remain particularly instructive. Nzinga operated in an environment where she was usually militarily weaker than her primary adversary, where resources were scarce, and where a single major mistake could lead to the destruction of her kingdom. Yet she not only survived but often thrived, outmaneuvering opponents through careful negotiation, strategic alliances, and the ability to identify and exploit her enemies' weaknesses. She understood that diplomacy was not simply about reaching agreements, but about managing perceptions, building relationships, and creating situations where her interests aligned with those of more powerful actors. Modern scholarship on Nzinga has evolved significantly over the centuries. Early European accounts written by Portuguese colonial officials and missionaries often portrayed her in negative terms, emphasizing aspects of her life that Europeans found shocking or barbaric while downplaying her achievements. These accounts were shaped by racist assumptions about African inferiority and by the political need to justify Portuguese colonialism. They portrayed Nzinga as an exotic curiosity, a savage queen whose resistance to Portuguese authority proved the need for European civilization. African oral traditions, by contrast, preserved a much more positive memory of Nzinga. She was remembered as a great queen, a warrior, a defender of her people who never surrendered to foreign control. Songs, stories, and historical narratives passed down through generations kept her memory alive in Mbundu communities. These traditions emphasized her courage, her intelligence, and her unwavering commitment to her people's freedom. They made her a figure of inspiration and pride, a reminder of a time when Africans successfully resisted colonial conquest. Contemporary historical scholarship has attempted to navigate between these competing narratives, using archival research, oral history, and archaeological evidence to construct a more balanced and nuanced understanding of Nzinga's life. Scholars have examined Portuguese, Dutch, and Italian documents from the 17th century, seeking to separate fact from propaganda. They have worked with Angolan communities to record and analyze oral traditions. They have studied the broader context of 17th century Central African history to understand the forces that shaped Nzinga's world. This scholarship has confirmed many aspects of the traditional narratives while complicating others. Yes, Nzinga was a remarkable leader who successfully maintained her independence against Portuguese colonialism. Yes, she was a skilled diplomat and military commander, but she was also a complex figure who made morally ambiguous choices, who participated in systems of exploitation even while fighting against colonial control, who could be ruthless when she believed ruthlessness was necessary. Understanding her fully requires appreciating both her achievements and her contradictions. The question of how to evaluate historical figures like Nzinga remains contested. Some argue that we should judge her by the standards of her own time, recognizing that she operated in a world very different from our own, where slavery was normalized, where warfare was constant and where survival often required morally compromising choices. Others contend that certain moral principles are universal, that participating in slavery was wrong in the 17th century, just as it is wrong today, and that we should acknowledge these wrongs even as we recognize her other achievements. Perhaps the most productive approach is to resist simple judgments altogether. Nzinga was neither a perfect hero nor a villain. She was a human being facing extraordinary challenges, making decisions with imperfect information and limited options, trying to protect her people and preserve their independence in the face of overwhelming external pressures. She succeeded in many of her goals, failed in others, and left a legacy that is mixed but ultimately inspiring. This complexity is not a weakness in her story, but rather what makes it historically valuable and humanly compelling. For modern Angola, Nzinga represents a link to a pre-colonial past, a time when African societies were independent and self-governing. After centuries of Portuguese colonial rule, followed by a devastating civil war that lasted from independence in 1975 until 2002, Angola has struggled to build a stable, prosperous nation. In this context, Nzinga serves as a symbol of national identity and continuity, a reminder that the Angolan people have a long history of resistance and resilience. She offers a usable past, a historical foundation upon which contemporary national identity can be built. Her relevance extends beyond Angola to the broader African continent. In the decades following World War II, dozens of African nations gained independence from European colonial rule. Many of these new nations sought historical figures who could serve as symbols of resistance to colonialism and as models of indigenous leadership. Nzinga, along with other African resistance leaders like Samori Touré, Menelik II, and Ya Asantewa, became part of a pantheon of African heroes whose stories were taught in schools, celebrated in national holidays, and invoked in political discourse. For women specifically, Nzinga's example has been particularly powerful. Across Africa and in the African diaspora, her story has been used to challenge patriarchal assumptions about women's capabilities and proper roles. If an African woman in the 17th century could lead armies, negotiate with European powers, and rule a kingdom for 4 decades, then clearly women in the 20th and 21st centuries can participate fully in politics, business, military service, and all other domains of public life. Nzinga becomes evidence against claims that women's subordination is natural or inevitable. Her story has been told through multiple artistic media. Historians have written scholarly biographies and analyses. Novelists have created fictionalized accounts of her life that bring her story to wider audiences. Filmmakers have produced documentaries and dramatic films. Musicians have written songs celebrating her achievements. Each artistic rendering interprets her story differently, emphasizing different aspects of her life and legacy, reflecting the concerns and perspectives of different times and communities. This ongoing creative engagement with her story ensures that she remains a living presence in cultural memory, rather than merely a historical artifact. Yet for all the ways Nzinga has been remembered and celebrated, certain aspects of her life remain contested or unclear. The exact circumstances of her brother's death, her involvement in the slave trade, the sincerity of her Christian faith, the details of her military campaigns, all of these remain subjects of debate among historians. The sources are incomplete, sometimes contradictory, filtered through the biases of those who recorded them. We will likely never know with certainty many details of her life, but this incompleteness does not diminish her historical significance. What we do know is enough to establish her as one of the most important African leaders of the early modern period. As we reflect on Nzinga's life from our vantage point in the 21st century, what stands out most is her refusal to accept the role that colonial powers sought to impose on her and her people. She refused to be subordinated, to be enslaved, to be erased. She fought for her people's freedom and dignity with every tool at her disposal. She adapted, survived, and ultimately triumphed in maintaining her independence when so many others succumbed to European power. This refusal, this insistence on self-determination and dignity, is perhaps her greatest legacy. The challenges facing Africa today are vastly different from those Nzinga confronted. The age of direct colonial rule has ended, though its legacies persist in economic structures, political boundaries, and cultural attitudes. The struggles now are against poverty, corruption, conflict, and the ongoing effects of centuries of exploitation. Yet the fundamental question remains the same. Can African peoples control their own destinies, determine their own futures, and maintain their dignity in a world where power is still unequally distributed? Nzinga's example suggests that the answer is yes, but that achieving self-determination requires courage, intelligence, adaptability, and unwavering commitment. In the small villages of Angola and the diaspora communities around the world, grandmothers still tell stories of Queen Nzinga to their grandchildren. They tell of her defiance in the Portuguese governor's hall, refusing to sit on the floor. They tell of her military victories against overwhelming odds. They tell of her wisdom in peace and her courage in war. They tell these stories not as ancient history but as living lessons, reminders of who they are and what they are capable of. In this way, Nzinga's spirit continues to walk among her people, inspiring new generations to stand tall, to resist injustice, to refuse subordination. Her grave in Matamba, though its exact location is now uncertain, is sacred ground. The kingdom she built eventually fell to new waves of Portuguese expansion and the chaotic violence of the 19th century slave trade. The political structures she created did not survive intact to the present day, but the memory of what she achieved, the example she set, the proof she provided that Africans could and would resist colonial control, these have endured. They endured through centuries of slavery and colonialism. They endured through the struggles for independence. They endure today in every African who stands up for their rights, every woman who refuses to accept artificial limits on her potential, every person who believes that human dignity is universal and inalienable. In the final analysis, Queen Nzinga's greatest achievement may not have been any single military victory or diplomatic success, but rather the simple fact that she lived her life on her own terms. She refused to be defined by others' expectations or limited by others' prejudices. She claimed her authority and exercised it with skill and determination. She made choices, some admirable, some morally complex, all profoundly human. She fought, she ruled, she survived, she endured. And in doing so, she left behind a legacy that continues to inspire, to challenge, and to remind us of the extraordinary things that human beings are capable of when they refuse to surrender their dignity and their freedom. Centuries may have passed, but her spirit still walks the lands she once defended, in the mountains of Angola where she once led her warriors, in the histories that scholars continue to write, in the stories that parents tell their children, in the hearts of all who struggle for justice and self-determination. There, Queen Nzinga lives on. Her name endures as a testament to courage, to intelligence, to the unbreakable human spirit. She was a warrior, a diplomat, a queen. She was Nzinga Mbande, and the world remembers her name. If this story has moved you, if you found inspiration in the tale of this extraordinary African queen who refused to bow to empire, then subscribe to this channel. There are countless other powerful stories from Africa's past, tales of heroes and heroines whose names the world has forgotten, but whose legacies deserve to be remembered. Together, we can ensure that these stories are told, that these voices are heard, and that history remembers not just the colonizers, but those who resisted them. Queen Nzinga's struggle is not over. It continues every time we refuse to let her story be forgotten. Thank you for watching.